Sorry for what I did to you. But now we're even.
Bye, Felicia.
You never know who might come back when you're not looking, Peter. Anyways, welcome back, true believers and all you spectacular Spidey fans, to another very exciting Marvel Spider-Man 2 related video, actually diving into some very interesting characters which may or may not return within the sequel that we have already seen as supporting characters within Marvel Spider-Man and Marvel Spider-Man Miles Morales. And joining me today with this topic is the one and only Irogen, who you probably have seen in some of my other videos in the past, and is also one of the founding members of the Gotham Knights community. And if you are someone who is very excited about Gotham Knights the game, and also the upcoming Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League game, definitely make sure to go follow and subscribe to him, and give him as much support as you possibly can. Jake, thank you so much for joining me today. How you doing?
I'm doing so good. Thanks so much for having me on the channel.
So, for starters, let's actually begin with the spin-off game within Insomniac's Spider-Man series with none other than Marvel Spider-Man Miles Morales, where one character in particular had a great role within the main narrative of the game, truly giving players an insight as to how exactly Miles is balancing the dual life that he is beginning to understand with him becoming Spider-Man, and how he, as Miles himself, can live properly without wearing the suit. But he has to learn it from someone who might have a bit of a different profession instead of the much more heroic side of things that we do see from a character like Peter Parker, who is obviously the mentor of Miles Morales within the Insomniac universe and the original Spider-Man. But the character in question that we're talking about is actually Miles' uncle, and also one of Spider-Man's most well-known villains slash anti-heroes, the Prowler. But in this case, we're talking about Aaron Davis. Now, within Miles Morales, spoilers, Aaron Davis did end up going to jail. But within the case of Marvel Spider-Man 2, I definitely think it would be extremely well-oriented if Insomniac were to revisit the Aaron Davis character by potentially having Miles visit him in prison in some type of side mission or maybe a small cutscene. But it would also be great to let Aaron Davis and Miles reconnect in a way, not just as themselves, but also as Spider-Man and the Prowler. It would also allow Aaron to see exactly how well Miles is doing within this universe, how far he has become as Spider-Man ever since the ending of his own game. And I'm assuming a time jump will occur from the ending of Miles to Marvel Spider-Man 2, and allow that type of father-son connection that they seem to have as uncle and nephew to be further expanded upon within the game. Even though I don't think we will fight against Prowler again within Marvel Spider-Man 2, I still think having that intimate connection that we did see from characters like Miles and his mother Rio, and also Miles and his best friend Genki, to also be continued on with Miles and Aaron Davis would be extremely heartwarming to see, which in turn would allow another confidant within Miles' inner circle to be well adjusted to the overall living situation that Miles is experiencing within Marvel Spider-Man 2 in comparison to what we saw in Miles' standalone game.
Another character that shows up in that first Spider-Man game is Morgan Michaels, and he, as some of you will probably remember, is the doctor who helps out Spider-Man. He's quite a bit of an ally, especially in manufacturing and distributing the cure to the Devil's Breath. So he is a big player in the plot, even though he is by far a secondary character and not in the spotlight. He is very pivotal to the success of Spider-Man's mission of stopping Devil's Breath. But what is interesting is that Morgan Michaels is an alias for Morbius. Now, we recently did see the Morbius film, and is it Morbin time for the sequel, Spider-Man 2? We'll have to wait and see.
It's Morbin time.
But could that character return? I think that he absolutely could. Again, he played a pretty pivotal role in that first game, even though it was fairly small. It was still important, and I do think that he could show up again, either once again as a supporting character, or perhaps he will return as the living vampire, as we have seen in the comics and in some of the animated shows, and now in the theatrical films starring Jared Leto. It'll be interesting to see what Insomniac's take on that character is, if they try to take him down a similar path that we've seen in those previous iterations, or if they will do something vastly different with him. Another thing about this sequel is that Bill Roseman, vice president of Marvel Games and executive creative director of all of the projects under that title, has mentioned that Spider-Man 2 is going to be a much darker experience than the first game. He said that if that first game was A New Hope, this game will be Empire Strikes Back. We're going to be, of course, seeing Venom and Kraven, who, if any of you have read the comics that go with those characters, they get very dark. And the addition of a character like Morbius could further perpetrate that claim that this is going to be a very dark game, that if we're seeing a character that is known for being a living vampire, that is something that could really play into the darkness of the story. The interactions that he could have with Venom and Kraven could be really interesting as well. And ultimately, it really would just fit in with the tone of this game. So to see a character like Morbius, and especially Insomniac's take on the character through Morgan Michaels, would be a really compelling direction to take those characters. It would also be really interesting to see Spider-Man's reaction to this guy who has helped him save so many people, now being put into a situation where he is essentially feeding off of all of these people that he once had the will to save as a doctor.
And adding on to that is actually one of the much more seductive characters within Peter Parker's rogues gallery, so to speak, or someone that Peter Parker himself has had a very intimate and rather complex relationship with, not only within the first game, but also which was heavily showcased in the spin-off comic book series of Spider-Man PS4 of The Black Cat Strikes. And of course, I am obviously talking about the Black Cat herself, aka Felicia Hardy. We obviously saw an entire story arc with her within the Heist DLC chapter of the City That Never Sleeps DLC pack. Now, though, I would like to see that taken to the extra level if we get to see Peter Parker interacting with Felicia Hardy when they are both out of their suits, because canonically we do know that Felicia Hardy knows that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. He did unveil his secret identity to her, and instead of the original comics where Felicia was kind of quote-unquote disgusted and taken aback by Spider-Man unmasking himself to her, Felicia was actually very accepting of Spider-Man's secret identity as Peter Parker, but they went their separate ways because of their own different lifestyles. And also allowing that chemistry to thrive even further within the Heist DLC made it even better when you know that entire background of their characters from the comic line itself. But the main reason why I would love to see Black Cat come back within Marvel Spider-Man 2, because I think that Peter and Felicia have great chemistry with each other, but it would also allow, potentially, if we end up getting Black Suit Spider-Man within Marvel Spider-Man 2, to get that deeper, intimate connection between Black Suit Spider-Man and Black Cat, and seeing how that type of narrative goes, not just from the comics, but also within one of my favorite Spider-Man games, Spider-Man Web of Shadows, which really displayed exactly what Black Suit Spider-Man would do if he let his innermost desires take over. I think it would allow for a lot of great interactions and chemistry between the two characters if something like that were to happen in the sequel. And the slight possibility could also occur if Insomniac decides to not only make Spider-Man and Miles and possibly Black Suit Spider-Man playable characters within Marvel Spider-Man 2, we could also maybe get Black Cat as a playable character, just like what we saw with Catwoman and Batman within the Arkham games. I think that would be an incredible usage of Felicia Hardy's character to make her an even more admirable asset within the Marvel Spider-Man universe, and hopefully expand that narrative even further within Marvel Spider-Man 2.
Another big one that could return is Martin Lee from, again, that first game. He was so heavily marketed. He was marketed really as the main villain before it was secretly revealed later in Spider-Man PS4 that Doc Ock was actually the primary antagonist of the game. And I would honestly argue that even though Doc Ock does take center stage as the main villain, Martin Lee, aka Mr. Negative, ends up taking most of the screen time and has the most prevalence of any of the villains in the game. And it would be interesting to see him make a return. His ending in Spider-Man PS4 was very abrupt. It is something that I was somewhat disappointed by, as I mentioned, even though Doc Ock was the main villain and the developers clearly were anxious to get to that next fight, I really did want to see what the resolution was. We see that Peter beats Martin Lee in that final battle that he has with him, and then he is attacked by Doc Ock and knocked unconscious. There has been a bit of inconsistency in what the fate of Martin Lee is. Brian Intihar, the creative director of that first game, stated that he is missing in action, while in Miles Morales there is a reference to him being in the raft. So he's either arrested or he is still on the loose. We don't know if he has defeated the Mr. Negative side of himself once and for all, or if that side of him could still return. Either way, it could be interesting to see in a sequel where Martin Lee is now, if he is attempting to reform and do good, if Mr. Negative is still a large side of him, and even if his prevalence was heavily lowered in the sequel, if he was in a side mission even, it could be really cool to see him once again and to see where he is at and what his relationship to Peter Parker would be now that Aunt May is dead. And now that he understands that his revenge against Norman Osborn really is somewhat unfounded. Would he try to get help from Spider-Man? Would he try to take down Norman Osborn more by the book? Or is he still completely enraged at Norman Osborn and now Spider-Man for halting his plans? And is he going to be a major threat once again?
And lastly, this should come to no surprise to anyone who is obviously a major fan of Marvel's Spider-Man and Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales. Of course, the overall narrative that was the foundation of the first game, choose the biggest sacrifice that he has ever had to make within the life of Peter in the Insomniac universe. Save the city, or save Aunt May. And of course, he had to end up sacrificing the one he loves the most in order to save the lives of the many. And the person who was responsible for that terrible decision that Peter had to make is none other than Dr. Otto Octavius, aka Doc Ock. And clearly by the time we see the ending take root within Marvel's Spider-Man, Otto is clearly thrown into the raft, facing the crimes that he has committed. But we also know that he is slowly becoming a vegetable, sadly, because he is still suffering from his genetic neurological disease that is making his muscles and his overall limb control less functional, which is more than likely a heavy tease to the Superior Spider-Man storyline, which could potentially be a massive setup for a possible Marvel Spider-Man 3 storyline if Insomniac wants to go the Superior Spider-Man route and make Otto an even bigger presence for Peter within future games. But as it stands right now, Otto is still imprisoned due to the crimes that he has committed, and hopefully we will get a type of interaction between Peter and Otto within Marvel's Spider-Man 2, not just to get maybe some clarity for Peter Parker after having to suffer through the death of Aunt May and Otto pretty much being the cause of that, but also knowing that Otto Octavius and Norman Osborn do have a heavy history with not just the Devil's Breath formula, but also Otto potentially might have knowledge about what exactly the symbiote is for the Insomniac Marvel Spider-Man universe that is currently wrapped around Harry Osborn, and Peter might end up taking the opportunity to visit Otto to get to the bottom as to what exactly is going on with the Osborns and what type of role the symbiote is going to have impacting Harry Osborn's health.
Another thing that was included in the end of that first Spider-Man game was the fact that Otto Octavius actually has knowledge of who Spider-Man is. He knows that Spider-Man is Peter Parker, and so I'm sure that there is a fragile alliance there, as Peter really does not want his identity leaked to the public, as we saw in Spider-Man No Way Home recently in the films, that something similar could happen in the games, where Otto could reveal his identity to the press or to the public. That would be a huge plot point for this sequel. It could also really tie into the fact that they have Kraven, who's trying to hunt down Peter Parker. And if Kraven went after Peter or his allies, that could be a really huge rabbit hole that this story could go down. Maybe the lack of having his arms will allow Otto to have a bit of clarity, and maybe he'll be more helpful. Maybe you will get that sweet, tender moment between Peter and Octavius, where Octavius essentially apologizes for what he did and for what he put Peter through. Or maybe it is a tease for Superior Spider-Man, where Doc Ock is going to try and infiltrate Peter's mind and take over his body. It could go in so many different directions. Insomniac left it very open-ended with Doc Ock knowing his identity and also losing control of his muscles and, like you mentioned, becoming a vegetable. So it will be interesting to see in the sequel if they bring back Otto Octavius. They did seem to tease that they would, and if they do bring him back, also what they will do with him and how he will interact with Peter.
Only time will tell to see exactly what Insomniac has up their sleeves when it comes to incorporating not just brand new characters within this universe like Venom and Kraven, but also, hopefully, acknowledging the past 2 games and potentially bringing back some of these all-star characters to give them even more of a bigger focus within the official sequel on a much grander way that we can even possibly fathom. And with all that said, everybody, that is the video that Irogen and I have for you today, and please let us know all your thoughts in the comment section down below. What do you think about this top 5 list of returning characters that we think need to be within Marvel Spider-Man 2? Which one is your personal favorite? Or do you have a character that you would like to see be in Marvel Spider-Man 2 that we did not mention? Feel free to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you did enjoy, and for more Marvel Spider-Man 2 videos like this. And definitely be sure to go and follow and subscribe to the one and only Irogen, who makes a plethora of amazing videos over on his channel, and will definitely make sure to make even more awesome videos by the time we get more news about Marvel Spider-Man 2 and the other upcoming Marvel and DC games like Wolverine, Gotham Knights, Suicide Squad, and much more. Thank you so much for joining me, dude. I had a wonderful time.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's always a pleasure to be on your channel.
And until next time, true believers, thank you all so much for watching. Stay spectacular, Spidey fans, and peace out.